Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Pública. In the episode of today, I will talk about a book that was published in 2021. It's called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. And it is a summary of the history of humankind having different perspectives, but their main argument is that the kind of common idea that since agriculture, the civilizations have been established and changed their previous idea of hunter-gathering, the kind of approach. Here, according to them, there were many different states of societies in different times, and even those who reached the state of agriculture were able to later come back to the hunter-gathering approach. So, this book again was published in 2021 by the anthropologist and anarchist activist David Graeber, who had died 1 year before, and the archaeologist David Wengrow. David Graeber is very famous because he was always talking in the public sphere. He participated in the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011 in New York. He has always been an anarchist and has written a lot of essays and books, including on Wall Street Job, 5,000 Years Dead, always having interviews with different newspapers, very keen to participate in the different social movements that were happening around the world, and always had a kind of political analysis very deep about what was going on in the surroundings. For him, anarchism was the most appropriate ideology to carry on society, and in that sense, some of his books have followed this idea of mutual aid, common solidarity, and empathy in order to grow up as people and to help the society. He has recently just been published a book of him, which is called A Pirate Enlightenment. I think I have not read yet, but reading the synopsis, it is a kind of idea of how some pirates in the 18th century reached an island in which there was a kind of anarchy system imposed on that island, and the pirates were amazed about that. This is a kind of similar government style as it is told in Utopia by Thomas More, a book which was published in the 16th century. I think it was 1513, something like that, in which Raphael Nonsenso, which is one of the main characters, tells Thomas More, who was the counselor of Henry VIII in England, how there was an island called Utopia in which people had established their own kind of system of cooperation between everybody. They had a kind of advanced technology for that time, and everybody had took on the participation within the different decisions of these societies. So, with this background, I will talk about some of the episodes of the book. I mean, the book is quite long. It has almost 100 pages. I would like to just cover 3 episodes, but I encourage all of you to kind of read this book because I think it has a different approach to other books that are incredible for the history of humankind. Like, for example, Sapiens of Yuval Noah Harari is great. I think here the difference is that in The Dawn of Everything, they try to avoid the kind of linear thinking in which it has always been told that since agriculture, all societies settled down and that was the end of their hunter-gathering age. In that sense, I will start for the chapter 2, which is called Wicked Liberty, in which David Wengrow and David Graeber talk about equality and liberty and the encounter between Europeans and natives. In that sense, they have a great theory in which they point how the Enlightenment, it was not a kind of result that happened just in Europe with the idea of the intellectual developing their own ideas by the sake of it, but rather how many people travel to other continents, and in those areas they discovered ideas that later on they put into Europe, and henceforth creating the current of the Enlightenment. Remember, the Enlightenment is the time of reason in which it was being believed that human beings had the ability to think logically about themselves, reason, and that will be the key to establish a society with freedom, liberty, and equality. In that sense, Graeber and Wengrow speak how the ideas of natives in America, the territory that was called at that time New France, had about the French explorers. Because the natives criticized the lack of freedom and solidarity between those people coming from France. And this is interesting because in Europe, there has always been this belief that it was the most advanced continent, but the natives there was some documents that they have explored in which the natives, they could not believe that those people were considered equal, as they saw difference in hierarchies, in the behavior, in the way they approach each other, whereas the native, far from it, had a more egalitarian system of cooperation between them. In that sense, the concept of personal freedom was rejected by the Europeans in the 17th century, whereas in those territories, the idea of liberty, freedom, and equality was widely implemented among those territories. In that sense, the authors point, for instance, they give a lot of examples during the book, but the system of peace of the Wendat, which was a tribe in America, and for example, they have interesting laws like compensation of the entire lineage for a crime. So let's say if a person from a civilization killed another, this person had to compensate the whole family for the atrocity committed. There was also the spirit of liberty that had not to be coerced to obey the leaders. And the kind of explorers who went there and witnessed this system being implemented realized that there was much less disorder than in France. This was written by Father Lullerman, who was there at that time. Interestingly, this spirit of liberty relates with the idea of anarchism, which in order to grow and fulfill its own potential, it must be leave free to kind of expand itself. Same as Emma Goldman mentioned with love, that love must be free. There is no other way, because you cannot put love inside a cage and expect that to grow, but rather it must to give itself the full expression through the possibility to expand its ideas through different people in different areas and so on. In that sense, the spirit of liberty must not be coerced. About the concept of equality, there is a difference between, for example, the Western Europeans and the Wendat. Remember the tribe that was in America. Whereas the Western European consider equality in common subjugation to the state, to the elites, to the upper powers. The Wendat consider equality as an extension of freedom. And in other words, equally free to obey or disobey orders, those orders who are considered unjust. Wendat, it is spelling Wendat in order that you want to investigate more about this tribe. But the thing is, like, the explorers were kind of compelling all the information that they could during their trips around there, and they asked themselves how the Wendat and the Five Nations decide the different matters that were happening, and their conclusion is that through open and rational debate. So they had this idea that in order to progress as a society, it was important that everybody should participate in the different areas of debate, the spheres of discussion in the area, and in order to do so, it was important the participation of the people. One of the most famous explorers, or let's say group of explorers that were going there at that time, were the Jesuits, and they praised the intelligence and rhetoric of the natives. For instance, they recognized an interesting relation between refusal of arbitrary power, open and inclusive political debate, and a taste for reasoned argument. Do you kind of take some reminiscence of that idea? refusing arbitrary power, open and inclusive political debate, and a test for reason argument. This is clear the premises of the Enlightenment, in which later the anarchists are the inheritors of it. So, using the reason, inclusion, equality, refusing the power which has not been made by the people themselves. And according to the authors, the French explorers and other Europeans went to America and other parts, took these ideas from the natives living there, analyzed their egalitarian societies and the different systems that they had to create a more participatory system. And after that, they kind of extrapolate those ideas in Europe. At that time, where there were monarchies in the continent, it was a hugely conservative, because this was before the French Revolution, which was the watershed moment that changed the European paradigm forever. So that is some of the aspects that appear in the chapter 2, Wicked Liberty. Let's go with the chapter number 4, which is called Free People, Culture, and Property. Here, the authors speak about the settlement and development of alternatives way of life, the idea of the modern rituals, and for example, I really like this idea that the rituals that the people were doing in the past in the different tribes, groups of people, and so on. It is the kind of, nowadays we have an analogy of that, and this analogy is the national holidays. So the national holidays that we enjoy today are the same, or are the kind of analogy of the past rituals. Why? Because according to Wengrow and Graeber, those are alternatives to mundane life. So let's say you are working every day and you are boring, you are tired, and suddenly you say, okay, in April we will celebrate, let's say, Easter, or you have like a bank holiday on Friday, and you say, okay, I cannot wait to enjoy that free day for me, because this will let you escape from the kind of boring routine to going to the office or whatever job you are doing. And in that sense, it is same as the kind of ritual of the past, in which people could disconnect themselves for what was happening around at that time. Apart from that, they point how there were similar tools in different parts of the world, like travelers during the Upper Paleolithic realized. Then it came the settlements, and people started to develop more parochial relations, creating more intransigent form of domination. This is one of the points that they take about how the egalitarian societies start to be crushed down when the kind of system change a bit with the settlement. People start to create their own half, alienate themselves more. Henceforth, the idea of equality was being diminished. But this was not something definitive, because some of these societies, after they change again and they came back to the former ideas of going around the cities and so on. But obviously, if they found a kind of rich area in resources, they tended to be there. In that sense, the authors wonder if this surplus as a cause of accumulation was it gave eventually to the consequence of the creation of the state, the state with the power of the church, of the king, later on the secular religion, but how the state, having the monopoly of violence, was able to do so through the accumulation of many centuries of a territory. In that sense, even in our contemporary world, there were genuine egalitarian societies, and they studied the Hadza, which is a forager society of Tanzania. It was after 1945, so after Second World War. There is an anthropologist called James Woodburn, who they cite him in the book, which mentioned that the truly egalitarian societies are those with immediate return economies. Immediate return economies refers to those approaches in which the resources are shared, eaten the same day, and never preserved. So why there is inequality for the same Godborn? He points how the delayed return economies make it impossible to create an egalitarian system as they invest in the future. These create ties that make people exercise power, and henceforth it is hard in that sense to establish an egalitarian system. And the last episode that I want to talk in the book, it is the chapter 7, which is called The Ecological Freedom. In this, Graeber and Wengrow had interesting ideas about how there was a kind of current called ecological imperialism from 1492, the year in which Cristobal Columbus reached America. And also they point how agriculture does not mean inequality. I mentioned that before, but this idea that when humans left their state as hunter-gatherers and established this system called agriculture, in which they were settled in a particular place, and in that time it was when the social classes started to be developed. They mentioned that there were some agricultural systems which were not unequal, whereas there were others that were highly so, as are the ones that have been more studied by the historians. In that sense, they mentioned some mechanism of sustainable agriculture, such as the communal tenure, redistribution, open fields, comparative management, and other kind of activities. In that sense, about how agriculture did not always mean the creation of an equal society, they point to the example of Fertile Crescent. It was based according to this idea of sharing the outcomes of the agriculture, taking care of others' activities, also using the communal tenure and some cooperative management. So this was one of the examples, but for sure there were many more distributed on the world. And also they point how there were some populations that returned from agriculture to foraging. So the history is not linear. In that case, there were some communities who, once they start to develop the agriculture, they decide to go back to their previous, let's say, state, coming back to becoming hunter-gatherers. In that sense, why the agriculture or different activities develop in different parts of the world? Well, obviously the geographical distribution, the climate conditions were fundamental for this juncture. They point how the continents in whose extremes till north to south are different propositions and perhaps less amenable to ecological transfer of species. Those were using different kind of approaches. For instance, for the first 1,000 years after the Ice Age, the farmer's crop had to compete with predators and parasites. And in that sense, it is when ecological imperialism is created. This was in global ascendance in European economy since the 16th century. Started with the Columbian Exchange after 1492, in which the people in Europe brought disease to America. They put also plants there that grow in the absence of pests. So everything was changing in the human species, non-human, and the other living beings, such as the plants, the trees, and so on. Because with this movement from one continent to another, it changed the whole kind of morphology of the fauna that was in different places. People died, animals that did not exist there before were being brought, same as different species of trees and other kind of beings. In that sense, just to finish about the book, they define three main kind of ages in our history. They point to the Imean interglacial that happened 130,000 years ago. This was when there was a global warming and the ice was melted, and henceforth people found new routes to explore. Nowadays, in fact, when it is talked about global warming, there are some countries that are interested in start to do business in the Arctic, which is the only place in the earth where there has not been inhabited by human beings. So, because the Arctic is in the north, there are some countries like Russia, USA that are very interested in what will happen then when this ice start to melt in a huge base. And studying to history, we see how 130,000 years ago, the melting of the poles, it served people to cross through different routes. The second age that they refer is the Holocene, that happened 12,000 years ago. This moment is when there was a huge movement around of the human beings, and after that agriculture started to be settled. This was the moment in which the temperature reached a moment in which it was easier for everybody to kind of establish in different communities. The hunter-gathering in some areas started to be abandoned for the modern system of agriculture, although as mentioned earlier, there were some communities who stay in the foraging state. And the last state that they referred is the Anthropocene. That happened 200 years ago, and this is ideological, socioeconomic, and political states of human beings in which now Anthropocene means that the humans are the most important part of the world. As Nietzsche say, like 150 years ago, that God is dead, that perfectly epitomized the idea in which the religion power has diminished and secular humanism has taken place in many areas of the world. Now, people tend to believe that they have the capacity for reason, to think critically about everything. This is obviously the current of the alignment that happened 250 years ago. So the period that we are living nowadays, it is referred by David Graeber and David Wengrow as the Anthropocene for that reason. Human beings are in charge of the earth. They have assumed this responsibility. At the same time, they believe to have the ability to construct different things which are taking its toll into nature. So the question is, which will be the next state of human beings? Yuval Noah Harari has studied widely about the future inventions like biogenetics, nanotechnology, and so on, and he points that it is possible that in a few hundred years there won't be humans anymore as we know that, because there could be like bio-humans in which there will be like kind of inorganic species built maybe in the image of the current human beings, but they won't have the skills that we have developed through evolution. In other words, it will be, according to him, the first time in history that an inorganic being is able to control the world. So just to finish here, The Dawn of Everything, it is a very interesting book. The two authors write very well, and David Graeber has written many books of fiction, and it is clear in the rhetoric that he uses that appeals to the reader. Like reading as a historian, it means also to know the skills of a literature writer, because those combine each other. I mean, histories has always been told in order to appeal the people and to teach a kind of metaphors and learn about different topics. And in this book, this is widely done. It is enjoyable to read. It gives you facts, but the narrative is quite consistent, and I highly recommend The Dawn of Everything, and cannot wait to read the last book of David Graeber, A Pirate of Alignment. So the combination of those two authors, an archaeology like Wengrow and anthropologists like Graeber, it coalesces perfectly in order to provide an insight about how our ancestors living before and how we can draw lessons to apply in our current times.